Hey guys, it's Trey here once again, and in today's video we're going to continue with our API gateway. In this video we're going to go ahead and add some basic authentication so that not anybody can just hit your gateway and do whatever they feel. So let's go ahead and do that. If we go to our registry.json file, we need to add a new object in here. So we have this services object here. Under the services object we need to add another object. So we're going to add this comma here, and then we're going to add in an auth object. So this is going to be our auth object, and then inside of this auth object we're going to add a users object. All right, and now that we have this users object, we need to go ahead and add in a user. So this user is going to be able to do pretty much anything on our API gateway. We're not going to worry about access levels at this moment. We're just going to go ahead and create a user and allow them to be authenticated. And if you're not authenticated, you can't do anything. So access levels will come later, but right now we're just trying to get the basic auth where it's only able for users that are defined in this users object can access our API gateway. And once they have access, they can do whatever they want. So let's go ahead and create our first user. So the way we're going to do this in this object is we're going to have the username as the key, and then inside of it we'll just have a bunch of information about that user. So we're going to set up our first user. It's going to be John Doe, and then John Doe is going to have an object. This object will have his username, which is going to be John Doe. Let me just add a little space there. All right, and then he's also going to have a password, which is going to be, you guessed it, password. All right, and from here, this is all we're going to do for right now. So he'll just have a username and a password. That's all we really need. If you're using a database, this is probably going to be, the usual setup for any type of authentication that you're using. So now we're just going to store it like this. We're not even going to hash the password or anything. We're just going to store it like this. If you want to hash passwords, you can do all that stuff. I'm not going to go over that right now. If you guys want to know how to do that in Node, then just drop a comment or something, and I'll go over that. All right, so once we get this users object created in our registry.json, we can go over to our gateway.js file. And here we need to add some middleware. If you're unaware of what middleware is in Express, basically it's just functions that run before, like in between the calls to your server or whatever. So this helmet function is a middleware function. This express.json function is a middleware function, and then these are our actual routes. So we're going to add our own middleware function here. So in between the helmet and the use routes here, we're going to add a function. So we're going to say const, I'm just going to call it auth. And then in here, we're going to have our request, our response, and next. So this is the basic setup for a middleware function. And then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and do all of our auth logic. So basically, we're going to need to get the user from our registry.json file, which we haven't imported here. So let's go ahead and import that up here under the app. We're going to say const, let's just do registry, and then we'll say require, and then we need to go into our routes folder and get our registry.json file. So now that that is there, we can go ahead and get our user. So I'm going to drop down to right here. We're going to say const user. So this is going to be our user from the registry file. So we're going to say registry.auth.users, and then we're going to pass in the username, because remember the username is what we are using as the key. And then once we get here, we need to go ahead and do our actual auth logic. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if user. So this is just going to check to see if the user exists. If the user doesn't exist, then we need to send an error response, but we're not going to do that right at this moment. We'll come back to that. So if the user does exist, then we need to check if the user.username the username, and if user.password equals the password. And then if it doesn't, then we're going to also return an error response that we are not going to set up right now. All right. And then if it does match, then we're just going to call the next function that we get from up here. So that means just continue. All right. So now you're probably wondering, where is this username and where is this password? I don't see where we established that at, and that is because we haven't yet. So we're going to get the username and the password from the request. So in the authorization header, we're going to grab that username and password from there. So what we're going to do is we're going to need to decode our username and password, because when you're sending basic authorization in the headers, what you're going to do is you're going to base 64 encode the username and password. If I'm speaking a different language at the moment, then I will go over all of this and I will explain what we're doing. So basically, we're going to have to decode the base 64 encoded username and password, and then we need to split it out into their two separate variables. So I'm going to do it, and then I'll explain it as we go, and then I'll explain it again after we finish. So just follow along. So what we're going to do is we're going to need to get the string. So we're going to have an auth string, and the way we're going to do this is we're going to say buffer dot from, and then inside of here we're going to pass in the request dot headers dot authorization. All right, and then we're going to do a comma, and then we're going to, inside of quotes, we're going to put base 64, and then we're going to say dot to string, and then we're going to say UTF-8. All right. So what we're doing here is we're getting the header, which is in base 64 encoded format, and then we're going to set it to a string in UTF-8 format. So that's all we're doing here. So we're getting this auth string. This auth string is going to have the, once we convert it from base 64 back into UTF-8, it's going to look like this. So if we use our John Doe example, it's going to say John Doe, and it's going to have a colon, and then it's going to say password. So when we pass this in, it's going to base 64 encode it. And then when we get it on the server side, we're going to take it from base 64 back to UTF-8, and it's going to look like this. So once we get this, we need to split this John Doe from this password. And we're going to do that by using this colon here. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to say const, and then we're going to have auth parts is going to equal auth string dot split, and then we're going to split on that colon. So now we have two separate things. We're going to have the John Doe part, and we're going to have the password part. So now we're going to need to set that up. So we're going to say username is going to equal auth parts, and then we're going to get 0 index, because this is splitting this into an array, and it's going to have two parts. So we're going to get the username is going to be the first part, and then we're going to set the password, and we're going to get it. It's going to be auth parts, and then 1. So this is the username, this is the password. And then just so you guys can see it, we're going to log this. So we're going to say console log username, and then we're going to put a pipe symbol, and then put in the password. So now whenever we hit the server, it's going to run this auth method, and then we'll see this username and password get printed out, so you guys can see that we're actually splitting it out. And then that's what we're going to use here, here, and here to get the authentication. So once we do that, we need to go ahead. This auth function is pretty much done. We just have to add in these functions right here. But what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add the middleware. So when you create a middleware function, it's not just going to run this. You have to call this app.use like we did here. So after we declare this auth, we're going to do it before we do our route. So before we put do this app.use routes, we need to put this auth method. So we're going to say app.use and then just type in auth. And now we have actually applied our middleware function. This is actually going to run this function before we call this routes. So now let's go ahead back up here into our auth and handle these returns. So if for any reason we fail at authenticating, we're going to pass back an object to tell the user pretty much what failed. So let's start out here with this. If the user doesn't exist, we need to tell the user that made the call that the user that they're trying to authenticate doesn't exist. So if the user doesn't exist, we're going to end up in this else block. So we get to this else block, and then we need to pass back some information. So what we're going to pass back is going to say authenticated. Too many THs here. Okay, so authenticated, and then we're going to say false because you weren't authenticated. And then we're going to have the path. The path is pretty much the URL that they sent. So let's go ahead, go up here and build out our URL. So we'll go here, we're going to say const URL. It's going to equal the request dot protocol, and then we're going to do the colon / and then we're going to say the request dot host. Oh, I need to put a plus. We're concatenating this, so I need to do a plus there. And then we're going to add in the port, and the port comes from up here. This is our port, remember? So we put our port in there, and then from here we need to put in the request dot path. That's what it is. So we're gonna do the request dot path, and this here will build out our URL. So this is the request that they made. So we're just going to pass it back to them, letting them know, hey, for this request, you're not authorized. So we're going to put the path is going to be the URL. And then we also are going to add a message. And this message is basically going to tell them that authentication unsuccessful. And then we're going to say user, and then we're going to put the username. We're going to say does not exist. All right. So that is going to be what we pass back. So basically we're going to tell them, hey, you're not authenticated. For this URL, you're not authenticated. And then we're going to say the user doesn't exist. That's why you're not authenticated. Okay. So we're going to pretty much copy this, and we're going to pass this back for in here as well. So basically, if the user does exist, but we check this and it doesn't match for some reason, one of these really is only going to be the password because the username we got from the registry. So in this case, the username is pretty much always going to match. So the only thing that's not going to match here is the password. So what we're going to do is we're going to say authenticate. We're going to say authenticated false. Then we're going to have the path is URL, and then we're going to say authentication unsuccessful, and then we can change this out to be incorrect password. All right. So now we're telling them, hey, you're not authenticated at this URL because you have the wrong password. All right, so this is pretty much it. This is our auth method. So now we're checking the username and password, and we're returning information if they aren't authenticated. We're telling them why and for what URL. And if everything checks out and the username does match and the password does match, then we're just going to call this next, which is just going to continue. It's just going to go on to this next routes or whatever else is going to. All right, so that's how we do our auth method. Now we need to go ahead and I guess really test this out. So the way we're going to test this is because this auth method is going to run for anything that you send to the API gateway. So no matter what request you send to the API gateway, we're going to run this auth method first to make sure that you're authenticated. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our fake API. So if we go here, we see our fake API here, and we're going to go to this server.js file. All right. So now that we have this open, we're going to need to set, whenever we make this Axios call, we're going to need to set the authorization header. So in the headers portion of this Axios method, we're going to need to go ahead and I'm going to put these on separate lines. And above the content type, I'm going to put the authorization. So we're going to say authorization. And then don't forget your comma at the end of that there. And then we're going to put in our base64 encoded username and password. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually erase that for right now. And then we're going to go up here into this function right here. Above the Axios, we're going to go ahead and encode our username and password. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const auth string. So this is where we're going to put our John Doe with our colon, and then we're going to put in our password. So this is, remember, this is the client that's calling the API gateway. So the API gateway in this case is going to be our server, and this fake API is going to be our client. So we're going to need to encode this username and password. So this is how we're going to do it. And you just type in this string here, and then now we're going to encode it. So we're going to say const, and we're going to say encoded auth string, and then we're going to do very similar to what we did in our gateway. We're going to say buffer, then we're going to say dot from, and then we're going to pass in our auth string, and then in quotes we're going to put UTF-8, and then we're going to say toString, and then in quotes we're going to put base64. So this is really similar to what we did in our gateway.js, except we flip-flop these because we're going from a UTF-8 string to a base64 string. And if we go back to our gateway.js file, we can see that we were going from a base64 string to a UTF-8. So we're just converting it the other way. So we're going from a string to a base64 encoded in our client. And then in our server, we're going from a base64 to a UTF string. All right. So that's pretty much what we're doing here. And then we can take this encoded auth string and just drop it in for our authorization. So now our authorization header is going to have the encoded auth string. And I guess we can go ahead and console log this so you guys can see that as well. Encoded auth string. So we're going to log that encoded auth string so you can see what it looks like. All right. And from here, we're pretty much good to go. I think we can test this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to run our server. Our server is going to be checking this auth method anytime we send a request. And you know, once we start up our fake API, it's going to send this Axios method to register our API. So this request here is going to hit that auth method, and then we'll actually see the logs come out for what's actually happening. So the first thing we're going to do is let's actually not include this authorization header first, so we can see what it looks like when it fails. So I'm going to comment out this authorization header here in our Axios method in the server.js of our fake API. So let's go ahead and run our API gateway. So I'm going to do npm run dev, and this is going to run the API gateway. So it says gateway started on port 3000, and then we're going to run our fake API. So I'm already in our fake API folder. Now I'm going to do node and then server.js. All right, and as you can see, we have an error here. So as you can see, it printed out our encoded auth string. So this is what the encoded auth string looks like right here. But as we can see, it says fake server started on port 3001. So it started, but we had an error with our auth function here. So we had an error with our auth function. So let's go back to our gateway.js. And as we can see, regardless of what's going on, we're going to try to decode this base64 string. but we never sent it. So there's an error here. So we should probably add some error handling for that, but I'm not going to right now. We're just going to test it out. So as we can see, we had that issue here. So let's go ahead. I'm going to stop both servers and restart the gateway first, and then I'm going to stop this server. And let's go ahead and uncomment this and see if it works. So now we have it uncommented and we have the correct username and password. So everything should work out. We should see the username and password get printed out here, and we should see the encoded auth string get printed out here. So let's go ahead and run that, and boom, there we go. Everything worked just fine. There are no errors. And we see we have a deprecated use of request.host. So let's go here, and it says use host name. So we're going to change this to host name just to stop that from happening. I'm going to rerun it just to make sure that goes away. All right, and it does. All right, so now we see that we printed out our encoded auth string here. And then on the server side, on the gateway, we printed out the username and password once we decoded it. So we see that works fine, and then everything else runs the same. So it says configuration as is for registry tests, which means that after it ran this auth method, it got to this next function here. And then this next function basically just continues on like regular. And we know that this gets printed out in the actual routes file. So we know that it actually authenticated and it went through. So now let's go ahead and test it out with an incorrect password. Well, let's do an incorrect username first. So if we go to our server JS in our fake API, and let's change John Doe to Jane Doe. Now Jane Doe doesn't exist in our registry.json file. So we should get, which one? We should get this back. The authentication unsuccessful and the user doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, that's what we get back. So we get authenticated false path, and then we get the path that we sent. So this is the URL that we sent our request to. And then we're saying that it's unsuccessful because the user Jane Doe does not exist. So we see that that is working correctly. Now let's test if our password is incorrect. So let's go here. We're going to go back and set our user back to John Doe because that is correct. And then the password, we're just going to change to PW. All right, so now we have the correct username, but the incorrect password. So I'm going to restart our fake API server. And boom, and now we have also another error. And then it's authenticated false. The path is the same path because that's where we're sending our URL to, our request to. And then the message is authentication unsuccessful. And then it's telling you that it's because it's the incorrect password. So as we can see, and then it doesn't print out, the rest of the stuff. So we know that it's not actually continuing on to this routes file and, running the code there. So we know that we're actually stopping that request from happening. So this is pretty much it. We've added basic authentication. There are a bunch of other things you can do with this, such as setting access levels and many other things. But that is all we're going to do in this tutorial. All right, thanks guys for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel and all that jazz. And I will see you guys in the next video.